Shalom everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you guys back to another English Torah video here on our channel Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's video, we're going to be studying and analyzing chapters 31 and 32 of Deuteronomy. The title for today's video is A Strong to Strive in Obedience and Holiness. In these chapters, we will be reading that Moshe continues repeating the words and laws of the Creator to a new generation of Israelites who were going to enter and conquer the Promised Land. The purpose of this was so that they would not forget the Creator when they conquered the Promised Land. Although in this case, we will read that these words were transmitted in the form of a song, where the language is similar to the one used in the Psalms and also similar to the language that some of the prophets used in their times. We will be learning in chapter 32 that the lyrics of this song were said in a figuratively and poetic way, and later on in the history of the people of Israel, certain events were going to be fulfilled. With this short introduction, let's begin with verses 1 and 2 of chapter 31, which says, Then Moshe went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Eternal told me, You shall not cross the Jordan. This chapter first begins by mentioning the age of Moshe that he had in the time he was dedicating a few words to the people of Israel, because as we have been reading in previous chapters, the people of Israel were already ready to enter the promised land and possess the lands. Therefore, Moshe needed to remind them of all the things their ancestors had experienced in the desert so that in this way they would not forget their Creator. Something that later on in the history of the people of Israel we will see that they rejected the Eternal and went behind the pagan gods. Moshe starts by mentioning his age, saying, I am now 120 years old. And something that he makes clear to us in this phrase is that at this time that Moshe was living, it was a custom to count the years that the Father allowed each individual to live. In this way, they would also always have complete knowledge of this opportunity that the Eternal was allowing them to have. In the case of Moshe, throughout the studies of Torah that we have been doing weekly, we can realize that during his pilgrimage, he was always serving the Eternal at all times until his last breath, which was a total dedication to his Creator. This at the same time becomes an example and reminder of how the Eternal has been good to us by allowing us to continue with our pilgrimage until now, something that is forgotten about in the world, since in most cases when our birthdays arrive, people tend to celebrate to themselves, being proud and acting as if it was because of them that they gave themselves lives. But now, as believers who have returned to the Father, we know that on the day when we begin a new cycle of life, we use that time to thank the Father for His goodness, ensuring that every day of our life that we may have, we are serving the Father, just as we see this recognition that is given to the Father in the life of Moshe, and also in the life of the Messiah, and even in the life of the disciples. In Psalms 100, verse 4-5, it says, Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him, bless his name, for the Eternal is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. In verses 3-5, Moshe continues saying to the people of Israel, The Eternal your Elohim himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as the Eternal said, and the Eternal will do to them what he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, whom he destroyed along with their land. The Eternal will deliver them to you, and you must do to them all that I have commanded you. We read in these verses that Moshe tells the people of Israel that they would not go to those lands alone because the Eternal would go before them. In these verses, once again, we can see the great promise and strength that the Father was going to give them, since if the Eternal was at their side, then they would have nothing to fear of. We can even read that the Eternal would do the same thing that he did to the nations of the Amorite kings, Sihon and Og. The Canaanite nations they were going to now conquer were already consecrated to extermination due to their genetic corruption. Furthermore, also because they practiced all kinds of abominations which the Eternal forbade the Israelites to practice. And these practices were to the worship of pagan gods, since in these pagan cults they would pass their children through fire to hand them over to the god Moloch. Also, it was forbidden for the people of Israel to do the sexual immoralities that would be practiced within these nations, such as adultery, fornication, incest, homosexuality, and bestiality. These are some of the reasons why those nations became detestable in the eyes of the Creator, and therefore their consequences was to be eliminated. The reason why Moshe tells the people of Israel not to be afraid of the nations of Canaan was because, if we remember, those nations that had been defeated in the east of the Jordan were dominated by giants who had walled cities that seemed unbreakable and perhaps also had extremely powerful weapons. But the people of Israel didn't have any of those powerful physical weapons because they were a simple people. However, they did have at their side the best and most powerful weapon that existed, which was the Almighty, their Elohim, who put fear in those nations and therefore fell before the Israelites. For this reason, it is why they triumphed over their enemies. In this case, Moshe needed to remind them of this so that they would not forget that the Eternal would do the same thing to the rest of the nations that they were about to conquer in this new stage where Moshe was no longer going to guide them. The people of Israel needed to know that although Moshe was no longer going to be among them, however, they would still have to continue to have enormous security in the Creator. Regarding reading these promises and security that the Israelites were going to have, today as believers in the Messiah, we have that same security in our Creator, always remembering that the same powerful one who opened the sea and destroyed these giants is whom we call our Father, and who is also with us, supporting our life and helping us to overcome our enemies. Although we do not face physical enemies like physical giants nowadays, however, we do have to face the giants and the walled cities of this world, which are the trials, the afflictions, the fears, the disbeliefs, the system of the world that offers everything, materialism, entertainment, and even the misleading dogmas and doctrines, religious doctrines that blaspheme against the Eternal and hide the truth of His word. But in the midst of all this, we can be sure that if we remain firm, always trusting in the Eternal and following the example of His Son Yeshua, obeying His instruction, then He will give us victory over all those enemies. And that is where what we read in Romans 8 verses 37 and to 39 applies, that we are more than conquerors through Elohim, and that nothing can separate us from His love. For He will keep us, and He will inherit the promise, and He will make us inherit the promised land, which is the eternal mansions. Just as we can read that the Messiah says in John 14 verses 1 through 4, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in the Eternal, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? Verse 3, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to go to be with me, that you also may be where I am. Verse 4, you know the way to the place where I am going. In verses 6 to 8, Moshe continues by saying, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the eternal your Elohim goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Verse 7, then Moshe summoned Joshua and said to him, in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with these people into the land that the Eternal swore to their ancestors to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Eternal himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. In verse 6, Moshe gives another reminder to the people of Israel about the importance of preserving, striving, chazak in Hebrew, and having great courage. This reminder was also important for the people of Israel to continue strengthening their faith in Elohim. This was something that Moshe constantly did in his personal life, because as we have studied in previous chapters, the previous generation that had left Egypt was left in the desert due to their disbeliefs, due to their complaints and their discouragement that they had when they heard the report of the 10 spies that went to the lands of Canaan, the ones that let their fear overcome them, and due to that fear is that they doubted in the Creator. This feeling of discouragement is precisely the tendency of human beings when we see that the situation we're in is getting difficult, it's getting worse. Or when we go through some trials because we start to lose heart, we start to lose trust, and we start to think that the Eternal has abandoned us. In this verse, we can realize that it is important to remain firm in our trust towards the Creator, never allowing our emotions to dominate us, nor to fall into discouragement or into complaints. But quite the opposite, always making an effort and trusting that our Heavenly Father is in control of everything. Let us be faithful to Him, because He will not leave us nor forsake us, just as He says in these verses to Joshua and to the people of Israel. And just as the Messiah said in John 16 verse 33, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulations, but take heart, I have overcome the world. In verses 7 to 8, Moshe repeats the same words to Joshua because he was now going to be Moshe's successor, since he received the ordination by the Eternal to lead the people of Israel and make them inherit the promised land and divide that land for each tribe. In the scriptures, we can read that this man was brave, he was dedicated, submissive, always willing to serve Moshe and the Father, always supporting Moshe and respecting his authority. And if we remember, Caleb and him were the only ones of all the 12 spies who went to inspect the promised land who came back with good comments and who remained faithful and trusting in the Eternal. Now that Joshua was going to take this big responsibility, he needed to be encouraged and exhorted not to faint, not to disbelieve, since the Israelites, let's remember that they were a stiff-necked people. They didn't really listen. They were always negative, and therefore this is the reason why Joshua had to be firm to fulfill his new responsibility. Later in the book of Joshua, we can read that he fulfilled his calling. He never left the path. He never gave up, but he continued to trust in the Eternal. And even in his last words, we can read that he expresses, "My house and I will serve the Eternal." He, like Moshe, is a shadow of the Messiah, Because just as he led the people of Israel to make them inherit the land, in that same way, the Messiah, Yeshua, is now leading us and guiding us to inherit the heavenly homeland. After all, he is our king and our great minister, the Redeemer of the true believer. Continuing with verses 9 through 13, he says, So Moshe wrote down this law and gave it to the Levite priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Eternal, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moshe commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the festival of the tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Eternal your Elohim at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Verse 12, assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns, so that they can listen and learn to fear the Eternal your Elohim and follow carefully all the words of this law. Verse 13, their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn it to fear the Eternal your Elohim as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. In verse 9, we can read that Moshe wrote the Torah and gave it to the ministers and the 70 elders of the people, since they would now be in charge of instructing and judging the people of Israel. In addition, these laws that Moshe wrote had to be read to the people of Israel at the end of every 7 years in a specific place that the Creator would choose. In that way, they would not forget the commandments of their Creator, and also so that every new foreigner, every new kid would know the Torah. In verses 12 to 13, it is mentioned about the 7th year. Let's remember that this year was special and was called the Shemitah year, where both the land and the servants of the people of Israel rested, and the debts of the peoples was forgotten, and they rested on the holy occasion of Sukkot, when everyone was gathered and joyful. The Torah was to be read to everyone, from the smallest to the elderly, and even to the foreigners. This is very important aspect because within Christianity, it is taught that the Torah is only for the Jews, but in these verses we can read that the Torah was not for a specific lineage. The Father had compassion, for everyone, and therefore he made the Torah for everyone, both for those who are part of his people, just like for us today who have been grafted into the true spiritual Israel, who believe in Yeshua the Messiah. In verse 12, when Moshe says that this reading should be done to the people of Israel so that they would listen and learn, retaining knowledge and understanding, so that in this way they would learn to fear their Creator. That fear that they should have is not only the respect and reverence that they showed to the Eternal, but that fear goes furthermore, because they would know the Eternal by what they heard, and then they would know that one of his attributes is rigor. The people of Israel had to be careful not to be severe, since it is understood that we are nothing more than creatures who must serve the Creator and make his instruction and keep his instruction to fulfill it. The people of Israel have to fulfill it so that their days would be prolonged and could live in the land that they were going to conquer with the help of the Eternal. Today, as believers, we are very blessed because through the surrender of the Messiah, we have returned to the Father, and we have at our disposal the instruction to be able to listen to it and also to learn from it and fear it and serve in that way the Almighty in spirit and in truth, always putting His word first. We have this treasure in our hands that we must take advantage of to continue cleaning our clothes, since the scripture shows us that to inherit the promised land, or the promise there is one condition, and that is that we must preserve and obedience and imitate our Messiah during our pilgrimage. Continuing with verses 14 and 15, it says, "And the Eternal said to Moshe, Behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting, that I may commission him." And Moshe and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting. And the Eternal appeared in the tent in a pillar of cloud. And the pillar of cloud stood over the entrance of the tent. In these verses, we can see that Elohim would confirm before the people of Israel that Joshua was the new successor of the people of Israel that the Eternal had chosen. And we can even read that the pillar of cloud descended in the Mishkan, which is why no one was going to be able to doubt or to rebel against Joshua and his new leadership, whom the leadership was now given to. And if anyone obviously doubted or questioned Joshua's new leadership, then it would be taken as if they were opposing to the will of the Creator. From verses 16 to 30 of this chapter 31, it is narrated that the Eternal tells Moshe everything that the people of Israel would do after he died. The Eternal tells him that the people were going to separate themselves from him to serve other gods and also commit the same transgressions as their neighboring nations. Furthermore, he tells Moshe that they are a stiff-necked people and that when they received the blessings that the Almighty had promised them, they would go astray, and indeed, that is what truly happened. That is why he gives a song to Moshe as a reminder of all these things, that when they sing it, they will know what their course would be like in the future. As we see here, the Father knows us perfectly. We cannot hide anything from him. That is why we must analyze our lives, always asking ourselves, how are we living, allowing us to strengthen our path. Undoubtedly, our flesh is weak, but this should not be used as an excuse, but just as the Messiah said, it is an exhortation for us to preserve even more. Always remembering that we are not alone, we have the Ruach of the Eternal, and although we have not achieved everything, let us continue striving to the goal to be found as workers worthy of such great salvation. Continue with chapter 32, verses 1 through 7, Moshe says, "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Eternal, ascribe greatness to our Elohim. The rock, his work, is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A Elohim of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he." Verse 5, "They have traded corruptedly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay the Eternal, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your Father who created you, who made you and established you?" Verse 7, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your fathers, and they will show you. Ask your elders, and they will tell you." Moshe, in this song, he begins with a language that is similar to the one written in the Psalms, and also the language that some of the prophets spoke, which was used figuratively and poetically. Although it is important to know that this song that Moshe said was not going to move emotions or was not with the purpose to sweeten the ears of the people through his words. Rather, these words had to be heard in the full sense of the word of the Creator, so that one day they could be understood, since at that time when these words were being said, perhaps the people of Israel didn't understand them, For this reason, it is why this song had to be transmitted generationally until the words were fulfilled. And in that way, these words would now make sense to the people of Israel. Also, these words would serve as an answer and witness showing part of the history of Israel, which was prescribed and prophesied in this Song of Moshe. This applied to the following years in the Promised Land, where Israel would forget the Creator, they will also grow fat, and the consequences would come to them. Although these words also reflect at the same time the human condition of today, leaving a message to every person who not only hears these words but also understands them, that we must strive in obedience and holiness before the Father, Creator of all the souls, to whom we must return and serve in fidelity and obedience, always trying to fulfill what the Messiah said in Luke 13, verse 24. Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to. And also always taking into consideration what the Apostle Shaul wrote in Romans 15, verse 4. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Another important fact that we find in this song is that although Moshe says it in a poetic and figurative language, he implies the word of the Creator by representing it as rainwater and dew that descends on the grass, which represents the people of Israel. It also makes us understand that the work of the Creator is perfect in comparison to the evil and perversity of the human beings. The purpose of this song was to take the people of Israel years back so that they could remember how it all began from their past generations. That is why it is important that the people of Israel in due time would repeat these words to their future generations so that they can also have this understanding. Continuing with verse 8, Moshe says, When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of Elohim. In this verse, Moshe mentions three important dates where the Eternal keeps his word or kept his word. And the first important date that he mentions is in the phrase when Moshe says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance. This, Moshe was referring to what happened in the time of Noah. The second important date, we can find it in the phrase when he divided mankind, referring to what had happened in Babel with Nimrod. And this event, we can find it in Genesis chapter 11. Also, Moshe mentions, or the third important date that we find within this verse is when he says he fixed the borders of the people. This is referring to what the Eternal did in the time of Peleg, and we can find this event in Genesis 10, verse 25. Continuing with verses 9 to 12, it says, But the Eternal's portion in his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. Verse 12, the Eternal alone guided him, no foreign God was with him. In these verses, we can see that Moshe mentions about Yaakov when he was in the lonely desert. This was when he was in Egypt, the place where Israel originated as a people of the Eternal, and where the Father not only cared for the people of Israel, but he also guided them. The same thing that he did to Yaakov when he was in the desert. And just as verse 13 says, that he was like an eagle that stirs up its nest. The phrase that we read in verse 13 when Moshe says he made him ride on the heights of the land, it is referring to the heights of the land of Canaan, of the lands of Canaan, which the people would be about to conquer. In verse 14, when Moshe says, fed him with the fruit of the fields, he nourished him with the honey from the rock, and with oil from the flinty crag, with curds of milk from herd and flock, and with fattened lambs and goats, with choice rams of Bashan, and the finest grains of wheat. You drank the foaming blood of the grape. All of these words that Moshe says in this phrase, or in this verse 14, it refers to the abundance and blessings that the Father would give to the people of Israel once they entered the promised land. And this was because, let's remember that the Eternal was not going to leave the people of Israel without any blessings or without any sustenance. However, this also refers to the excess of confidence and comfort and corruption that the people were going to fall into later on in its history, when they no longer trusted in the Creator and they did whatever they wanted. Moshe in verse 15 even confirms this when he says, Jeshurun grew fat and kicked, filled with food. They became heavy and sleek. They abandoned the Eternal who made them and rejected the rock, their Savior. And here Moshe was referring to the fact that the people of Israel were going to go after other gods, completely forgetting their Creator, the one who freed them from Egypt to now be able to serve their Father without oppression, and their Creator who was now fulfilling his promise that he gave to Abraham about the promised land. From verses 16 to 26, we can read that Moshe warns the people of Israel that they were going to go after pagan gods when they lived in the promised land. And we can see this being fulfilled in the time of Joshua until the time of the judges, where everyone did as they wanted to and according to what they thought was correct. We can also see this being fulfilled in the time of the kings, and as a result of all of this disobedience, the Creator says that he will hide his face from them. Furthermore, we read that the Eternal was going to use other towns or other nations such as Syria and Babylon to punish Israel for their actions, although this punishment was also going to be accompanied by famine and plagues that would descend for 2 years through these nations. This punishment that was going to come to the people of Israel was going to be for everyone. There were not going to be no exceptions, from the smallest to the eldest, regardless of the age that they had. We can even read in the history of the people that they ended up exiled, with the purpose of scattering them far away to erase their memory of all the pagan practices that they used to do. This may sound harsh to us, but let's remember that it was for the good of the people of Israel, because as we know, every single human being pays for their actions, and the Eternal does not overshadow the sinner, but quite the opposite. We can see in the history of the people of Israel that the Eternal was still going to have mercy on them, because he was not going to destroy them, but only punish them harshly so that they would be able to learn their lesson. The Eternal would only be fulfilling the role of a true father, a father who loves his children and therefore disciplines them with instruction when it is needed. In verses 27 to 35, we can read that although the Eternal would use foreign people to punish Israel for their rebellion, but something that the Eternal was not going to allow those people to do or to think was to become arrogant, believing that it is by their own merits that they defeated the people of Israel, when in reality it was by the will of the Creator that they were able to do it, just as the Eternal said in Deuteronomy 32 verse 35. It is mine to avenge. I will repay, in due time their foot will slip. Their day is disaster, the day of disaster is near, and their doom rushes upon them. This was what happened to Babylon later on in the history of the people of Israel because of that pride that they felt. We can read that Babylon was not dominated by the Persians and their king Nebuchadnezzar. And we can find this event in Daniel 4 verses 28 through 34. In verses 36 through 47, we can read that Moshe says that although the Eternal would punish Israel for their disobedience and assimilation that they would fall into later on, he would punish them out of love, but he would not completely destroy them. And we can see this being fulfilled later on, since despite their disobedience and foolishness, the Eternal never destroyed them as he did with the other nations who practiced the same pagan things that the people of Israel ended up doing. And these words of the Song of Moshe were for all the people who had to apply them to their hearts, because in this it was found the style of life that the people of Israel were going to have in the future, and it depended on them whether or not to prolong their stay in the promised land. That is why these words were of utmost importance for these people. In verses 48 through 54, we can read the death of Moshe on Mount Nebo. It is written that the Eternal gives him instructions to climb the Mount Nebo to see and contempt the land of Canaan. Since let's remember that the Eternal told Moshe and his brother Aaron in Numbers 20 verses 1 through 13 that they were not going to enter the promised land due to the disobedience they committed in front of the people. That is why the Eternal in these last verses of chapter 32, he tells Moshe in these verses that just as his brother Aaron died on the Mount Or, in that same way Moshe was going to die in the Mount Nebo. But before his death, in the next chapter, chapter 33, we will be reading about the blessings that Moshe gives to each tribe, which in the next video, we are going to be analyzing with more detail these blessings. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for taking your time in studying these chapters, and we will see each other in the next time. Bye.